Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome to the first ever episode of Lipstick and Murder. My name is Tiffany, and in this podcast, we are going to be talking about the women of the true crime world, the female murderers and serial killers. So I'm going to throw a little statistic out here for you. So there was a study. It was conducted by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime back in 2000. It was a global study done on homicide to look at the different demographics and the statistics on homicide. 98% of all homicides committed worldwide were committed by men, meaning that only 2% of all global homicides were committed by women. Now, to some, that may sound like a very small number. However, that doesn't really take into account that there are certain countries whose statistics of women who have committed murder are pretty high. And then you have some countries where that number does not exist. There are no women who have committed murders in certain countries around the world. But it's a very interesting statistic, and it was definitely a statistic that caught my attention because, to be frank, we don't really hear a lot about female serial killers and murderers. We have a couple that are notorious: Casey Anthony, Jodi Arias, most recently Lori Vallow Daybell, and there are certain ones that are pretty famous: Julia Tofana, Belle Gunness, but we don't really hear about a lot of the ones that are lesser known, that you may not have heard of, the ones that honestly made a name for themselves but have kind of fallen through the cracks of the history books. So that was really the purpose and the reason that I started this podcast in the first place, was because I really wanted to shed some light on these special women, dare I say. And so if you're here along for the ride with me, let's go ahead and get started with Lipstick and Murder. So for today's episode, I am super excited to be talking about this very special lady, because the first time I ever heard of her, I was like, oh my God, this woman is insane. Literally insane. And she made headlines all over the world when she was arrested and her subsequent trial afterwards. So I think you guys are really going to like this one. So today we are going to be talking about Lizzie Brown Halliday. Have you heard of her? Have no idea who she is? Well, either way, we're going to talk about her today. Now, before we get started, I am going to preface this with a content and trigger warning. We are going to be talking about murder. We are going to be talking a little bit about mental health, and we are going to be talking about attempted suicide. So if any of these subjects or subject matter, related subject matter, triggers you or is upsetting to you, please click out of this audio. Please click out of this. I don't want you to be stressed out or to be triggered by anything that we're going to talk about today. So just a quick warning before we get started. So Lizzie was born Eliza Margaret McNally. It is unclear when exactly she was born, but we think she may have been born around the year 1859 in County Antrim, Ireland. So she was Irish. She was one of 10 children. So her parents had 10 kids, and she was one of them. Well, duh, obviously. But so there were a lot of kids in that family. Now, it is unclear of the date, again, when they actually moved, but it is said that the family immigrated to the United States, and the latest date that we have that can be agreed upon is 1867. So if that date is correct, and if her date of birth is correct, then she would have been about 8 years old when the family immigrated to the United States. Now, one thing that is important to remember about this point in history is that this was a time frame where a lot of Irish citizens were making the passage to the United States for a better life, because about 15 years before the family moved to the United States, Ireland was experiencing what would be known as the Irish Potato Famine, or the Great Potato Famine, as some call it. This was probably one of the worst events in Ireland's history because people were dying of starvation and of disease, and it was just not good. And of course, at this point, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. They weren't their own country at this point, they were part of the United Kingdom. And they really weren't getting any help from the government at this point, and a lot of the people were just feeling neglected and feeling like their government didn't care, which kind of was how it was back then. And so they felt like they needed to do something. They needed to pack up their families and move because otherwise they were going to die. They didn't want to die of starvation and disease. They wanted their kids to have a chance at life and to have a chance at, making it to adulthood at this point. And so a lot of them, even though the potato famine ended around 1851, 1852, a lot of families were still making these trips and going to the United States because it took such a toll on the country, this whole ordeal with the potato famine, that even after it happened, families were still like, nah, we need to get out of here. We need to go. There was still residual effects that were going on in the country. And so Lizzie's family, the McNallys, like a lot of families, made the passage to America. Now, I will say this, from the time that the famine started to about 1920, there was upwards of 5 million Irish immigrants that landed on the shores of Staten Island. There were over 5 million people who came to America from Ireland alone because they just did not want to live in a place where they were afraid that the famine would happen again. They were scared. They were trying to find a way to get a better life, not just for themselves, but for their children. Now, this is the other side of the coin here. Once they got to America, once they got to the United States, it was a whole different ballgame, because if you were from Ireland and you immigrated to the United States, especially at this time in history, you were considered worse than dirt. Out of all the immigrants who came in through Staten Island and who were given citizenship to the United States, the Irish were treated terribly. There was huge prejudice going on in the United States, especially if you were Irish. It was very normal at this point in time to walk down the street in America, especially New York City or places like Boston, big cities, and see signs in the windows of shops that said, Irish need not apply, meaning if you're Irish, do not apply for a job here, and Irish not welcome. Basically, this was awful. It was an awful predicament that the Irish had found themselves in. They came from a country where their government wouldn't help them because their people were starving to death. And then they come to the quote-unquote land of opportunity, as it's been called, and the people there don't want them either. And so I can only imagine what it was like for the McNallys, being this family of 12 people coming to America, and the place they came from didn't want them, and the place they're at didn't want them either. And it had to be difficult to be an Irish citizen or an Irish American at this point in time. But nonetheless, the family did settle in New York City. They obviously managed to make it and to at least survive in the United States. But one thing that really struck me, and this was something that was kind of like, oh, this is a light bulb moment. There were reports, especially early in her childhood, that Lizzie was kind of violent. She had a really bad temper. and she would get into physical altercations with her family all the time, which eventually led to her being estranged from the family. She basically packed up her things and left one day while she was a teenager. Now, when I say she was a teenager, I'm guessing she was anywhere between the ages of 17 and 19 when she left home. Because in my mind, when I think a teenager leaving home, I'm thinking like 16 or older. Because at that point, they're like, I'm moving out, I'm never coming back kind of mentality. So, so she packs up her things, she leaves. She, from what I understand, she probably never speaks to her family ever again. Now, we next find her in 1879, so she would have been about 19 or 20 at this point, and she's getting married in Pennsylvania to a man by the name of Charles Hopkins. Now, here's the thing about Charles. Charles was not his real name. His real name was not Charles Hopkins. His real name was Catespool Brown. And Mr. Catespool Brown was a con artist. He was a con artist. And so he was very good at lying. And obviously he got very good at lying to Lizzie. Now, it is said that they did have a child together, a son. There's not really any record of what his name was or, what happened to him, later on in life. But they did have a son together. Now, Charles, aka Catespool, would die in 1881. It's not really clear on how he died or where he died or why, things like that. So it's very unclear. Doesn't really say. Doesn't give a whole lot of information. But he died in 1881. Conveniently, Lizzie, in the same year, would marry another man by the name of Artemus Brewer. He was listed as a pensioner, which when we're talking about pensioner, that is typically someone who collects a pension from the government, whether it be because they're disabled or they're retired or they, have a military pension of some kind. And what we do know about Mr. Brewer is that he was a veteran. So I'm going to assume that pension did come from the military. And so he was taking a check from the government every month. And, well, he died also less than a year later after they got married. Interesting. So he dies, and not long after that, she marries another man. His name is Hiram Parkinson. Not much to know about him. Weeks after they got married, he vanished. Poof, gone. Gone with the wind. Just gone. And so he's gone. And so sometime after Mr. Parkinson vanishes, she meets another man by the name of George Smith. Now, Mr. Smith was also a war veteran. In fact, one of his war buddies was Artemus Brewer, her second husband. And so she marries him. So this is her fourth husband, guys. Okay. Now, it was reported that she put arsenic in his tea, which, if you know anything about arsenic, you know that arsenic is a poison. So she tried to kill him. And obviously, when her attempt failed, she ran. She took her stuff. She stole some money from him. Yeah, that part was pretty funny. And she took off. And she ended up in a little town called Bellows Falls, Vermont. So she's gone from Pennsylvania, and then she went to Vermont. So she's in Vermont. Now, keep in mind, this is 4 husbands she's been married to, right? 2 of them are dead. 2 of them are still alive. And one of them has vanished. The other she ran away from because she tried to kill him and, she stole money from him. So there's that. So then she gets to Vermont and she meets this man by the name of Charles Plaisdell. So this is husband number 5. Okay. Well, 2 weeks after they got married, Lizzie disappears. She's gone. She nowhere to be found. Nobody knows where she went. So, if you're keeping track, she now has 2 husbands that have died, and she is now married to 3 different men at the same time. Now, in some places, that is called polygamy. But, but of course, back then, they didn't really have a way of tracking these kind of things. So, here we are. Now, the next time that she is seen is in the winter of 1888. She is seen in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So, she goes back to Pennsylvania. And she is now going by the name Maggie Hopkins. Now, while living in Philadelphia, she runs into a family called the McQuillians. They were a family that were most likely neighbors of the McNallys in Ireland. So these people knew each other. They probably knew who she was. And I'm guessing that even though she changed her name, they probably knew that that wasn't her real name because they knew who her family was. So I'm guessing that they knew that that wasn't her real name, and she probably told them something to the effect of why she changed her name. So there's that. So anyway, she ends up setting up this shop, like a store of some kind, while she's living in Philadelphia. Now, some people may be wondering, well, how did she get the money to set up the shop? Well, keep in mind, she had 2 husbands that died. One of them was a pensioner, so he had money coming in. He was collecting checks every month. So she was probably taking his money, and she probably had money stowed away. And then the last husband that she married, poor Charles, or I'm sorry, not Charles, George, her poor husband George, the war veteran who had served with her second husband, Mr. Brewer, she took off with his money. So she had money from several different husbands that she was using to fund her life, her lifestyle, essentially. And so she ends up, setting up the shop. And then she does something really stupid. Lizzie, you did something really stupid. She burned down her business so she could collect the insurance money. And guess what? She got caught. And so on St. Patrick's Day of 1888, she was convicted of arson. And so she got thrown into the Eastern Penitentiary in Philadelphia for 2 years. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know that with her first husband, Charles Hopkins, you know that they had a son. Right? Well, I mentioned that we're going to hear about him. Well, he has been following his mom everywhere along the eastern seaboard, and so he's been with her this whole time, right? Now, because she got sent to prison, and because there was no other legal guardian that he got sent to a juvenile institution. And that's kind of the last we hear of him, because apparently, according to the facility that he was put in, yeah, he had the same violent tendencies that his mother had at that age. So, yikes. So he was very much going down the same path that she was. And so we don't really hear much about him after that. I think he just stays in that institution until he becomes an adult. I'm not entirely sure. There wasn't any information about him other than the fact that he went to the juvenile institution. And so that's where he ended up, and I don't think she ever went back to collect him, which is sad, but at the same time, it might have been better for him. So, so he ended up in that institution. Now, after serving her sentence in the Eastern Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, she is released in 1889. And at this point, she changes her name to Lizzie Brown. She was going by Maggie Hopkins at this point, but then changed her name to Lizzie Brown. She ends up in Sullivan County, New York, and she meets this man named Paul Halliday. Now, Paul is a Civil War veteran as well. He is collecting a pension just like 2 of her previous husbands. He has been widowed twice before, so he had 2 wives and they both passed away while they were married. He has at least 3 sons. 2 of them are older and don't live with him, but one of them does because he is disabled. And this disabled son, his name is John. And so he lives with Paul on his property in Sullivan County. Now, Lizzie comes to Paul and works for him as a housekeeper. And they seem to get along pretty well. So good, in fact, that he marries her in 1890. So, Paul is now husband number 6. And let's just say their marriage is a bit of a roller coaster. So, to kind of give you an idea of what their marriage was like, in the span of 3 years, she stole a team of horses from him, work horses, on his farm. She took them to Newburgh, New York, which was the closest town to them, to sell them. She burned down part of their house. She burned down a barn, and she burned down a mill building. So she is just causing havoc left and right. She's just going to town, literally. Now, remember how I said that Paul has a son named John that lives with him because John is disabled, right? When she burned down part of the home, John was inside. And so he died in the fire. And according to reports, Lizzie claimed that John saved her from the fire, and that's why he died, because he was trying to get her out first. But they found his locked bedroom door in the rubble of the home, which indicated that he had been locked inside his room when the fire started. And guess who had the key? Yep, Lizzie. Lizzie had the key. And so Paul's starting to realize that his wife is not right in the head. She has burned down his home, one of his barns, his mill. She has sold his horses. And basically at this point, he basically sent her to an asylum. Although I'm not sure if it was him who sent her or if it was the authorities after everything that happened. But she was sent to an asylum. And she was sent there, and then from what I could gather, she was sent to a different asylum. And at that asylum, basically somebody had the bright idea to say, nope, she's cured. She's no longer insane. She can go home. She can be free. I really have to wonder about the sanity of the person who made that argument, but okay. So she comes back to Sullivan County in August of 1893. And I can imagine that Paul was not exactly happy to see her. I mean, I don't know how I would feel about my wife murdering my son and burning down my home and stealing my workhorses and basically taking away a lot of my livelihood. So I don't know how I would feel. But she returned in August of 1893. That same month, Paul disappeared. Yep. He disappears. And the neighbors get real concerned because they have watched as Paul and Lizzie's marriage has deteriorated practically overnight. It has just gone from bad to worse, and it's just bad. And so they asked her, where's Paul? Where is he? We haven't seen him. Lizzie's response? Oh, he's out of town. He had to do some masonry work in the next county over. Like most good neighbors, they did not believe her. They did not believe her 1 second. They were suspicious. Suspicious. They did not believe her. And so they called the authorities. And the authorities got a search warrant, and they searched the property. Now, when they searched the property, they didn't find Paul. What they found was a little bit more disturbing. They found the bodies of 2 women in the barn underneath the hay. These women were identified as Margaret and Sarah McQuillian. You remember the McQuillian family in Philadelphia? Yeah, it's those people. So this was the wife and daughter of the man who had given her a place to stay in Philadelphia. And the story of why they were there is a little confusing because obviously she stayed with this family in Philadelphia. They knew who she was. But there were some who believe that Margaret had no idea who this woman was. The wife had no idea who Lizzie was when she came to her home and said, "Hey, I need to hire you. I need to hire somebody for some help on my property." It was believed that Margaret didn't know who she was, which doesn't make sense to me because this was the same woman who had lived in her house when she had come to Philadelphia that first time in 1888. So that doesn't make sense to me. She probably knew who she was, and I'm not sure of the circumstances. She probably knew who this woman was. She just, we will never really know whether or not what really happened. And so Margaret goes off with Lizzie to the property, and it is speculated that she drugged Margaret and she shot her. She was found shot in the hay. And so she goes back to find Sarah, who is the daughter, and says, "Hey, your mom's in trouble. She's hurt. She's sick. I need your help." And Sarah, obviously worried about her mother, goes to help Lizzie. And same thing. She drugs her and she shot her. Now, that was really just messed up for me because I'm like, what was the purpose of this? Like, what was the purpose of killing the wife and daughter of the man who took you in Philadelphia? What was the purpose of this? But then again, we're starting to see a pattern that Lizzie is kind of off her rocker. And so I'm not sure if there was a reason. I wonder if she was just feeling, murdery that day. I don't know, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, they found their bodies under the hay. They had been bound, they had been drugged, and they had been shot. Now, she was questioned about this. She didn't really give any information about it because, her behavior became very erratic whenever she started being questioned about this. She was talking incoherently. She was tearing at her clothes. She just was acting very strange, And so some may have thought that she was faking insanity, but there were some people who really believe, yeah, she's gone nuts. She's completely gone off the rails. Now, keep in mind that the authorities were still searching the property at this point because they were still looking for Paul. That was the whole reason they were called out there, because the neighbors were concerned that something had happened to Paul. A few days after they were called to the property, there was this smell that was coming from the kitchen that was not a smell that you wanted to smell. It was awful. It was an awful stench that was coming from the floorboards of the kitchen. So the authorities, they tore up the floorboards and they found Paul's body. He had been shot, much like the McQuillian girls had been, and his body had been brutally mutilated. And so, with the discovery of Paul Halliday's body, Lizzie was arrested and charged with the murders of Paul Halliday and the McQuillian women. And she was held in Sullivan County Jail in Monticello, New York. Now, while she's in custody awaiting trial, they really saw how unhinged she really was, because she tried to attack the wife of a sheriff. She set her bed on fire. She tried to hang herself and tried to slit her own throat with a broken piece of glass. And obviously, the two attempts that she made were unsuccessful. And when they asked her about why she cut herself with the glass, she said, quote, "I thought I would cut myself to see if I would bleed," end quote. So, so they basically had to chain her to the floor of her cell 24 hours a day after that, to keep her from harming herself and others. So that was the condition of what was going on while she was awaiting trial. Now let's talk about the press in this case, because the press played a major role in how this case was perceived, not just nationally, but globally, because of some of the articles that were printed at this time about Lizzie. Some of them were true, some of them were not true. And that definitely played a big role in how it was perceived and what people thought at the time about this case, because at this point, everybody just assumed that everything was being printed was true. And it wasn't necessarily true. And so that definitely played a huge part in the attention that she received, because of this case. So the New York World stated that Lizzie's case was, quote, "unprecedented and almost without parallel in the annals of crime," end quote. And I found this quote kind of interesting because there were definitely certain cases that were going on around this time that may or may not have been worse than the case of Lizzie Halliday, but it definitely was colored, in my mind. Her case was definitely colored by the fact that she was of Irish descent, and Irish immigrants in general were treated much worse than most. And so I think that definitely had something to do with how she was painted in the public eye for this. Now, the New York World did have a reporter that had rose to fame at this point. Her name was Nellie Bly, and Nellie was able to interview Lizzie, while she was awaiting trial. And in this interview, she was able to basically get Lizzie to reveal that she had been married 5 times before marrying Paul Halliday. This was huge because no one knew until now that she had been married 5 times before. And they were able to verify this information, and it really brought to light, was Paul Halliday the only husband she had killed? That brought a lot of speculation and a lot of scrutiny, because they're seeing that she has 2 husbands that died less than a year after they got married. She has a 3rd husband who she attempted to poison. So she's got this string of husbands that we don't know what actually happened to them. And so now they're thinking, well, we knew she may be responsible for 4 people dying, but now we think the number might be 6 people. And in case you're wondering, why is it 4? We're talking about Paul, his son that was living with them that died in the fire, and then the 2 McWillian women. And now we've got 5 and 6, which would be her previous husbands. And so it really was not looking good for her at all. Because in regards to the husbands that she had previously, the New York Times was known to say, quote, "Whether these men died natural deaths or were murdered is not known," end quote. So there was a lot of speculation around what actually happened to the previous husbands she had. And to add insult to injury, Robert Halliday, who was one of the older sons of Paul Halliday that we talked about earlier, he told the press that Lizzie had confided in him about a previous husband she had in Belfast that she had killed. Now, this is questionable because if you know anything about Belfast, Belfast is in Ireland. Belfast is where she would have been from originally. It is historically founded that she came to America when she was a child. Okay, very few historians agree with the notion that she came to America when she was a teenager. A lot of them agree that she was a young child when her family immigrated here. So this claim is questionable, and I'm wondering if maybe she was confused when she told him that, or maybe he was just looking for another reason to lock her up because, she murdered his dad. you know? So it's really speculative as to this story, but I don't think that it's completely true. So, but that's not even the worst one. So, Sullivan County Sheriff Harrison Beecher, remember that name. We're going to talk about him a couple times during this podcast. Harrison Beecher, he's one of the county sheriffs for Sullivan County. He told the press that Lizzie was somehow connected to Jack the Ripper, who was famous for murdering in the Whitechapel district of London around this time. Couple problems I have with that. First of all, how did he figure out the connection between her and Jack the Ripper is my question. There's no real indication or proof that she was somehow connected to this person. Second of all, the timeline does not fit. The timeline of when Jack the Ripper was active in London was from 1888 to 1891. Do you know where she was in 1888, guys? In prison. She was at the Eastern Penitentiary in Philadelphia in 1888. She didn't get out until 1889. There is no way that she was Jack the Ripper. And so even if she had gotten out in 1889 and somehow gone to England and came back, she was married to Paul Halliday during that time frame also. So there's no way it could have been her, you know? And it was just so funny. And even Lizzie didn't agree with his statement because he asked her about it. He confronted her about this. And she said to him, quote, "Do you think I am an elephant? That was done by a man," end quote. So, yeah, even she was just like, this is stupid. This is ridiculous. Even I know that I could never pull that off. Are you crazy? Now, once she went to trial, there was quite a bit of media attention. It was a huge circus. It was just a spectacle. But she did go to trial, and then on June 21st, 1894, she was convicted of murder and became the first woman in history to be sentenced to death by the electric chair. Now, this caused quite a bit of stir, obviously, because at this point, the electric chair was a brand new device that they were using as far as sentencing was concerned. And so there was an uproar about it, right? And so the New York governor at the time, his name was Roswell Flower, he ended up commuting her sentence to life in a mental institution. Now, when this was something that I found kind of funny. Remember how I said we were going to talk about Harrison Beecher, one of the sheriffs of Sullivan County? When Lizzie heard of her conviction, she launched herself at Sheriff Beecher and bit him on the hand. Now, I thought that was pretty funny because, you know, he did start the rumor that she was connected to Jack the Ripper. It was kind of funny. And eventually he did lose that hand to infection. They had to have it amputated, so that was an interesting fact that I found kind of funny. But, you know, so she was sentenced to life in a mental institution eventually. She was sent to the Matewan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in New York, and she remained there for the rest of her life. Now, there are a lot of reports that are kind of mixed on how she behaved at the state hospital. I'm calling it the state hospital because I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure I butchered that name. But some say she was a model patient and she was great and she got privileges and she did great. Other people say no, she fought with, you know, attendants at the hospital and just was combative and not, you know, not a very nice person. However, there was one attendant that she was very close to. Her name was Nellie Wicks. She was an attendant at Matewan State Hospital. Now, Nellie and Lizzie grew close, but Lizzie got very upset because it was found out that Nellie was going to leave the hospital because she was going to be a nurse. She was going to go to school and be a nurse. Well, Lizzie, in 1906, cornered Nellie in a supply closet and stabbed her to death 200 times with a pair of scissors. Yeah. She didn't like that. So that was the icing on the cake for Lizzie, I guess. It was not a fun time. So, and eventually, Lizzie did pass away on June 28th, 1918. She died of Bright's disease, which is a type of kidney disease that causes the kidneys to inflame. From what I could tell about this disease, it's possible she may have gotten a UTI and it just spread and caused her significant damage until she died. So, not very fun way to die, very painful. Ugh. For those of us ladies who have ever had a UTI, you know what I mean. Those things are painful. I couldn't imagine it getting so bad that it caused me to die. So, there you go. But that is the story of Lizzie Brown Halliday. At the time, she was called the worst woman in the world when she was sentenced. So, yeah. Lovely woman. Lovely, lovely woman. I really wonder what happened to her son, though. I wonder if he ever, followed his mother's footsteps or if he just kind of melted into the background. I don't know. I don't know what happened to him. That was really strange. So, yeah. She's a character, isn't she? Well, if you have gotten to this point, I just want to say thank you so much for listening to the very first episode of Lipstick and Murder. I am so excited to be doing this podcast, and I can't wait to record future episodes. So if you have any comments, suggestions for future episodes, I definitely recommend sending me an email. I will leave my email in the description so that you can send me your ideas. Let me know what you want to hear about next, because I'm always open to suggestions. But I definitely am super excited to be starting on the next episode of Lipstick and Murder, so I hope you will join me for that. In the meantime, this has been Lipstick and Murder. My name is Tiffany. I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye!